Some legends don't announce themselves. They sit quietly in seat 23F. Harrison Ford wasn't there to be seen. But at 30,000 feet, when the engines failed and fear took the cockpit, he stood up, not as an actor, not as a hero, but as a pilot who had already earned his place in the sky. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. The flight from Phoenix to Seattle had been uneventful for exactly 53 minutes. Passengers chatted softly, headphones buzzed with podcasts and playlists, and the cabin hummed with the steady rhythm of a Boeing 737 cruising at 30,000 feet. Outside, the skies were clear, an uninterrupted stretch of blue over the Rockies. Row 23F was occupied by a man wearing a weathered baseball cap pulled low over his brow, sunglasses shielding his eyes even in the soft interior lighting. A folded aviation chart rested across his lap, not digital, not glowing, just paper and memory. He traced invisible routes with his finger, silent, unnoticed. Harrison Ford was flying as a passenger, but he hadn't stopped being a pilot. Then, the pop, sharp, metallic, too deliberate to be turbulence, it cracked through the fuselage like a snapped bone. A few passengers looked up. Most didn't register it, but Ford's head tilted toward the sound with the instinct of someone who'd once had their hand on a trembling control yoke at 7,000 feet with a smoking engine. The next 10 seconds stretched thin. A tremor rippled through the floor, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The right engine had failed. The lights blinked once, then darkness. The cabin dropped into an eerie silence before chaos rushed in. Screams pierced the quiet. Oxygen masks fell like pale fruit from the ceiling, swinging wildly. The aircraft pitched forward gradual, then steep, triggering gasps, prayers, the sharp cries of children. A toddler wailed somewhere near the front. Someone shouted for help. A middle-aged man clutched his chest and slumped against the aisle. The plane was no longer flying. It was falling. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an emergency systems failure. Please remain seated and secure your masks. The captain's voice came through the intercom, ragged, barely composed. The words didn't calm anyone. They just confirmed what everyone already feared. The flight attendants scrambled, eyes darting, checking rows, trying to follow emergency protocol with shaking hands. One of them, a woman in her early 40s with a professional bun and a voice meant to command order, unclipped herself and rushed toward the rear. Someone had passed out. She moved quickly, calling over a younger attendant to help. As she neared row 23, she paused, just for a moment, enough to register something unusual. Among the panic, people clawing for air, bracing for impact, one man remained still. Harrison Ford had removed his sunglasses. His eyes weren't wide with fear. They were scanning, not the crowd, not the window, but the overhead panel. The cluster of emergency lights, the sensor reads, the subtle cues of a failing system. His face carried no expression of panic, only calculation. Like a man watching the skies for changes in wind, like a man who'd seen this before. The attendant opened her mouth as if to speak, but stopped. He wasn't just calm, he was engaged, and not in prayer or denial, in assessment. She moved past him toward the unconscious passenger, but glanced back once. Something about the way he was sitting, alert but restrained, told her that he wasn't waiting for rescue. He was preparing for something else. The plane jolted again, more severe this time. A suitcase flew from an overhead bin and struck the floor. The screams rose in pitch. Harrison Ford quietly folded the aviation chart, slid it into his jacket pocket, and unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't stand, not yet. But he was no longer just a passenger, and soon everyone would know it. The plane rattled again, harder this time, as if the sky itself were shaking it loose from altitude. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom, a tremor beneath every syllable. This is your captain. We are trying to stabilize the situation. Please remain seated. Oxygen masks, secure them tightly. It wasn't reassurance. It was a man losing control. The cabin moaned with noise, crying children, frightened whispers, a phone call that wouldn't connect. In row 14, a teenager laughed nervously and elbowed his friend. What now? That old guy back there's gonna save us. What's he gonna do? Quote Star Wars. A few passengers chuckled, desperate to pretend fear into humor. The old guy in row 23F didn't respond. He was already halfway turned toward the aisle. The sunglasses were gone, revealing eyes that moved with quiet speed. His seatbelt was unfastened. In his lap, a pair of brown leather gloves, creased, worn from use, rested like tools waiting to be picked up. The head flight attendant, Carla, had just helped revive a passenger who had fainted near the back. Her hands still trembling slightly, she turned and scanned the row and stopped. There he was, not panicking, not frozen, watching, calculating. It hit her all at once. She'd seen him before, or rather, she'd seen people react to him. Airports, air shows. That one older mechanic in Tucson who swore he once shared airspace with him in a vintage Husky. She didn't speak immediately. There wasn't time to be certain. The plane shuddered again, and something in the ceiling sparked and hissed. Still, she walked toward him. Sir, she said, trying to keep her voice level. He looked up, not startled, just present, fully. You're Harrison Ford, aren't you? He nodded once, quietly. I need to get to the cockpit, he said, not a request, not a boast. A simple, calm declaration. Carla hesitated. Protocol didn't allow unauthorized passengers near the cockpit. But this wasn't protocol. This wasn't a textbook, and this wasn't a passenger. Before she could answer, a voice from behind piped up. Wait, what's happening? Who is he? Someone called. Is he like an actor? Another asked. A man too rose up, said louder, we don't need movie stars, lady. We need a real pilot. Carla turned, her voice sharp. He is. She didn't explain, because she didn't fully understand it herself. She just knew it. Ford was already moving. He didn't rush. No drama. Just stood, slid the gloves onto his hands, one finger at a time, and nodded toward the front. But as he approached the forward cabin bulkhead, Carla blocked him again. Wait, she said, more instinct than resistance. The door's locked. Emergency lockdown after system failure. I can't get you in. Ford didn't break stride. He veered slightly left, toward a narrow panel just behind the galley. It was one of those things most crew forget exists. He knelt, felt along the base of the wall, and pulled a thin strip of rubber molding back with 2 fingers. Behind it, wound tightly and nearly invisible, was a cord, not electrical. Manual backup. Carla's breath caught. Ford tugged it once, and a magnetic release clicked inside the wall. How did you? She started. He looked back just for a moment. There's always a way in. You just have to know where the seams are. The panel swung open. A narrow path to the avionics bay and cockpit. The kind of entry you'd only know about if you de-studied the Boeing 737 like a mechanic, or flown one. Carla stepped aside. The murmurs behind them grew. The same people who mocked were now whispering his name, but Ford didn't seem to hear them, or maybe he just didn't care. He disappeared into the narrow corridor without a word. Back in the cabin, the boy from row 14 leaned forward. Wait, that's Indiana Jones. His friend swallowed hard. No, that's Harrison Ford, the one who really flies. The cabin rattled again. But for the first time since the descent began, the sound wasn't fear. It was tension shifting into something else. Recognition, hope. The cockpit smelled of ozone and sweat. Warning lights pulsed across the instrument panel like frantic heartbeats. One engine display was dead. The other blinked with erratic voltage spikes. The screen in front of the pilot's seat flashed a message that no one ever wanted to see at 30,000 feet. Total engine failure. Captain Reynolds was slumped against the side panel, his breathing shallow, his oxygen mask dangling uselessly from one hand. The co-pilot, younger and conscious but clearly dazed, was pale and shivering, fingers trembling as he tried to navigate menus on a frozen glass screen. Panic had made his training fade. He didn't even look up when the hatch creaked open. Harrison Ford stepped inside without hesitation. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing off the chaos of the cabin. The air here was thinner, colder, and tense with failure. But Ford didn't ask questions. He didn't demand control. He moved like someone who had already counted the steps in his mind. His gloved hand reached across the main console and flipped the emergency override, killing the malfunctioning autopilot system. The aircraft jerked slightly. The co-pilot gasped. Ford didn't flinch. He scanned the displays, what was left of them, checking for residual hydraulic pressure, manual trim access, backup battery response. The rudder had gone slack. He reached for the manual stabilizer crank with his left hand and began adjusting. Slowly, smoothly, the plane responded with the slightest correction in yaw, just enough to stabilize the tilt, just enough to say, "Someone capable is in charge now." Behind him, Carla had followed. She stood at the threshold of the cockpit, unsure if she was witnessing a rescue or a miracle. Her voice came out smaller than she expected. "Were you in the Air Force?" Ford didn't look back. "I flew medevac runs in the 60s, used to land on dirt strips with crosswinds and no tower. Later, I flew search and rescue out of Jackson. Once had to put a husky down on the Snake River with a broken crankshaft and a hiker in the back seat." He adjusted the trim again. "But this," he paused, eyes narrowing at the windscreen, "this one's going to be tricky." The co-pilot looked up for the first time. There was sweat across his forehead and panic behind his eyes, but something else too, relief. Who are you?" Ford didn't answer. He didn't need to. The nose of the aircraft had leveled out. The dive had become a controlled glide. They were still dropping, but now with purpose, with intelligence. Carla stepped farther in, one hand gripping the frame. "You're really doing it," she whispered. "I don't understand how, but the plane's listening to you." Ford reached over to pull oxygen toward the unconscious captain and adjusted the flow manually. It wasn't protocol. It was instinct. In his hands, the system stopped arguing. The machine wanted to fall, but it wasn't falling anymore. It was flying, barely, but flying. Back in the cabin, another attendant leaned toward Carla and spoke under her breath. "I just looked him up," she said, her voice shaking. "He's not just an actor, he's a certified pilot. Fixed-wing, rotorcraft, multi-engine, night ops, has over 5,000 flight hours." Carla blinked. "He's flown people out of canyons," the attendant added. "In real life." Carla didn't reply. She didn't need to. She was watching him, the way his shoulders moved, not rigid, not loose, but balanced, the quiet precision. There was no ego, no panic, no rush, only focus. Ford made a small adjustment to the elevator trim. The cockpit went quieter, as if the aircraft had taken a breath. The co-pilot sat back in his seat, no longer trying to take over, just watching the man beside him work. The clouds outside shifted. The horizon appeared again. For the first time in 12 minutes, the sky had a shape. Carla exhaled. "That's not Indiana Jones," she said. "That's the guy who made him believable." And for the first time, someone in the cockpit smiled, not because it was over, but because they finally had a chance. In the operations tower at Greensboro High Point Airport, the silence had turned heavy. The main radar screen blinked in red, where Flight 848 should have been transmitting clean telemetry. The aircraft was still visible, barely, but every known communication channel had gone dark. No transponder ping, no radio response, no confirmation, just altitude decreasing. A controller leaned over his headset, voice sharp. "Flight 848, this is Greensboro Tower, do you copy?" "Nothing, just static." Another voice broke in from the back room. "We've got emergency transponder codes flagged. Dual engine failure. Possible pilot incapacitation." The room shifted from calm to combat mode in seconds. Emergency protocols activated. Fire units were alerted. Medical teams mobilized. Runway clearance procedures initiated. Inside the tower, a supervisor in his early 40s took command. "We need identification on who's flying that plane, if anyone is." Someone near the radar console muttered, "If it's on autopilot, it won't hold long without engine thrust. They're gliding and losing altitude fast." Then the headset squawked, clear, strong, calm. "Greensboro Tower, this is Harrison Ford, assuming temporary command of Flight 848. Aircraft is experiencing complete engine failure, requesting emergency vectors and priority approach for dead stick landing." For a second, no one spoke. The words hung in the air, suspended between disbelief and protocol. The lead controller looked up from his console. "Did he say Harrison Ford?" An assistant pulled up the call record and replayed the transmission. Same steady voice, same name. The tower supervisor stared at the radar. is this a prank? Someone hijacking the frequency? But something about the voice wasn't right for a prank. It carried weight, experience, no panic, just purpose. Requesting updated wind vectors and longest available runway, no functional thrust. Glide ratio compromised. The voice returned, measured, controlled. A junior technician looked up from his screen. We still don't have cockpit confirmation. Flight crew is unresponsive. Then who the hell is this guy? The supervisor asked. I mean the Harrison Ford. Before anyone could answer, a second signal broke through. Different channel, stronger band, military encrypted, now open. This is Brigadier General Thomas Briggs, United States Air Force. Harrison Ford is recognized as an emergency qualified pilot. He holds multi-engine certification and has been cleared under special protocols for command authority in civilian emergencies. I repeat, Flight 848 is under legitimate temporary control. Provide all assistance and comply with his requests. The control room went silent, not just still, silent. A room full of professionals suddenly aware they were dealing with something far outside the manual. The supervisor slowly picked up his mic. Flight 848, you are cleared for unrestricted emergency approach. Longest runway available, winds calm, fire crews are on standby. Say again, you are clear for full priority. Copy that, Ford's voice replied. Beginning glide slope configuration. We'll need a hard touchdown zone and minimal flare room. No go-arounds possible. Understood, the controller said, his tone now respectful. Runway 5R confirmed. You are number 1 for all traffic. We're clearing airspace in a 5-mile radius. Outside, red lights lit up the tarmac. Emergency crews lined the runway edges like sentinels. Radios clicked from tower to truck to triage. But inside the tower, no one spoke of fame or movies anymore. They spoke in headings, altitude, descent rates, because whoever was at the controls wasn't an actor now. He was the difference between a controlled emergency and a national tragedy. The radar blip ticked closer, still descending but steadier. Slower, someone whispered, he's really doing it. The supervisor looked out toward the runway, then back at the screen. Damn right he is, he said. Let him work. 30,000 feet had become 20, then 15, then 11. The Boeing 737 no longer sounded like a jet. It moved like a silent metal bird gliding through invisible seams in the sky. Without engines, without thrust, it wasn't flying, it was falling with intelligence. And at the controls, Harrison Ford was shaping that descent like a sculptor with only one shot at the marble. In the cockpit, the emergency indicators still flashed useless warnings. The screens were dim, power drained, or flickering, but Ford wasn't looking at them. He wore a simple analog pilot's watch on his left wrist, scratched and sun-worn. He checked the second hand, made a small adjustment to the yoke, and then reached down to crank the manual trim. One click, then another. The co-pilot stared at him in disbelief. We are too heavy, he muttered. We'll stall short. Ford didn't answer right away. He was watching the tree lines shift through the windshield, reading the terrain like a map only he could see. Then, finally, he said, not if we float her just long enough. In the passenger cabin, the air was taut. Nobody moved. Every small sound felt louder now. Someone sobbed quietly. Another whispered a prayer. The entire aircraft was quiet, not because the crisis was over, but because something had changed. They could feel it. The panic had been replaced by a nervous reverence, like sitting in the back row of a church when the sermon suddenly mattered. Near the rear galley, a young girl cried out. Maybe 6, maybe 7. Her mother tried to soothe her but couldn't find the words. Ford turned his head just slightly, his voice low but firm. It's all right, sweetheart, we're going to touch down soon. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. The kind that made people believe even when they didn't understand. And for reasons she wouldn't be able to explain for years, the girl stopped crying. Ford went back to work. He adjusted the flaps manually, feathering them to match the changing wind resistance. Without power, every move had to be exact. There was no margin for second tries. The aircraft glided like a wounded hawk, guided only by geometry and gut. From the fourth row, a young man leaned toward his wife. He hadn't spoken since the engines died. Now his voice was tight with awe. "That's him," he whispered. She looked at him, confused. "Who?" "Harrison Ford," he said. "I trained under him for glider certification back in 2012. He used to guest teach in Montana, emergency descents, mountain drafts, wind shears. His lectures were boring as hell, but every story he told started with a failure and ended in a landing." She stared at him. "You're saying he's done this before?" "Not like this," the man said. "But if anyone could land this thing dead stick, it's him." The glide path narrowed. Ahead, Greensboro's longest runway stretched like a promise barely within reach. Ford watched the crosswinds, felt the rudder's sluggish response. One hand on the yoke, the other on manual trim, he leaned forward and whispered, not to anyone, not even to himself, but to the airplane, as if asking it for just a few more miles. Behind him, the co-pilot spoke again, this time softer. "I don't know how you're doing this." Ford didn't look away from the glass. "I've crashed before," he said simply. "That's how I learned not to." The altimeter ticked down. The plane was still falling, but no longer without purpose. It was heading home. One calculation, one breath, 1 second at a time. The runway came into view like a silver ribbon stretched across a sea of green. Heat shimmered at its edges, and faint wisps of smoke curled near the horizon from the emergency flares already lit. Harrison Ford studied the angle. The Boeing was silent now, both engines cold, props frozen in place. The only thing keeping the aircraft in motion was gravity and the will of its pilot. No second chances, no go-around. This was it. Ford adjusted the trim one last time, coaxing every ounce of lift from the wings. The glide was shallow but true. The wind slipped across the fuselage, whispering over metal as if trying to decide whether this bird still deserved to fly. The co-pilot checked altitude, then checked again. 400 feet, he said softly. 360, Ford didn't respond. His hands stayed steady on the yoke, his eyes fixed on the threshold. He wasn't flying with fear, he was flying with memory. The kind etched from years of close calls and long landings. At 200 feet, the ground detail sharpened, lines on the runway, flashing beacons, silhouettes of fire trucks positioned off to the sides. The wheels were down. Manual gear release had held. The hydraulics weren't ideal, but they were working. Ford banked slightly to the left, straightening the nose to match the runway centerline. Crosswind from the east, not strong, but sharp enough to notice. He compensated with a soft rudder tap, then trimmed again. Inside the cabin, the silence was total. No one dared speak, not even a whisper. It was the kind of quiet that only comes when 100 souls surrender their control and place their fate in the hands of a stranger. And somehow, everyone knew those hands wouldn't fail them. 100 feet, the flaps were locked, descent angle locked, sink rate perfect. It wasn't a landing, it was a glide threaded through a needle. The 737 touched down at 128 knots. The wheels kissed the tarmac with the gentleness of a pilot who'd done this before in fields, deserts, and canyon ridges. There was no bounce, no screech. Just the weight of steel meeting earth and deciding, finally, to rest. Ford deployed the speed brakes manually, his right hand pulling the levers with practiced control. No reverse thrust, just physics and rubber. The plane slowed. Slowed more, rolled past the halfway mark. Brakes hissed. The nose dipped slightly as the final deceleration took hold. Then, silence again, full stop. The Boeing came to rest just shy of the emergency vehicles waiting at the far end. No fire, no smoke, no collapse. A perfect dead stick landing from 30,000 feet. In the cabin, it took a moment before anyone moved. Then a breath, then another. And then applause, explosive, spontaneous, raw. People clapped like they were trying to shake off fear, to replace adrenaline with gratitude. Some cried, others laughed, but they all looked forward, toward the cockpit, toward the man they hadn't noticed until he saved them. The co-pilot turned slowly toward him, voice hoarse. "Thank you," he said. "Captain Ford." Ford gave a short nod, no smile, just a breath, deep and even, as if letting go of everything he'd held during the descent. Outside, the rescue teams rushed in. Paramedics, firefighters, federal agents, investigators. But when the door opened and Ford stepped onto the tarmac, no one shouted. No one grabbed him. The radios went quiet for a beat. People just looked, and those closest to him did the only thing they could. They nodded, just once. That quiet, unmistakable gesture of respect reserved not for fame, not for celebrity, but for those who do the impossible and walk away like it was nothing. Ford didn't linger. He helped guide the emergency crew to the cockpit, made sure the captain was being cared for, then stepped back into the sunlight. Behind him, the engines were still dead, but the legend was. And it never needed fuel. 1 week later, the same airline prepared for another full flight. Different crew, different passengers, but the same route, Phoenix to Seattle. At the gate, the usual rhythm played out, scanners beeping, children clutching backpacks, tired parents balancing coffees and carry-ons. Boarding was smooth, efficient. Every seat accounted for, except one, row 23, seat F window, still empty. The head flight attendant stood at the front of the plane, reviewing her final manifest. Printed in neat font among dozens of names was one that made her pause. Ford, H. No check-in, no boarding scan, no cancellation, just a name, and an empty seat. She didn't call it in, didn't ask the gate agent. She just reached for her red pen and drew a quiet line through the name, but she didn't assign the seat to anyone else. She let it stay open, as if it belonged to the sky now. Across the aisle, a young flight student barely out of training age settled into his seat, adjusting the zipper on his bomber jacket. He glanced at the empty window seat, then looked around, almost disappointed. Is it true? He asked the older man beside him, that he really landed a 737 with no engines? The man nodded slowly. I wasn't there, he said, but I know a guy in Greensboro Tower. Said it was like watching gravity change its mind. The student shook his head. I read about him, the crash in Wyoming, the rescue flights in Idaho, the vintage aircraft collection. I always thought the stories were exaggerated. The older man chuckled. They are, but not the landings. Those were real. The plane pushed back from the gate, engines hummed, wheels rolled, and 23F stayed empty. In a quiet house nestled near a canyon ridge in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a mailbox sat under the weight of snowmelt and pine needles. Inside was a single envelope, no return address, no official stamp, just a seal, military. The handwriting was precise, clean. Inside one note, a single sentence. Harrison, some people fly with authority, others fly with instinct. You are both cleared for any sky. Brigadier General Thomas Briggs, United States Air Force. Ford read it once, folded it carefully, slid it into the back of a leather logbook that already held pages from another lifetime. He didn't post about it, didn't call anyone, just walked outside, looked up, and watched the sky. It didn't salute, it didn't sing, but somehow it felt like it nodded back. And far above, somewhere between altitude and memory, legends kept flying, without engines, without noise, and without needing to be seen. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.